Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming today. Professor Rajamohan, I don't think needs an introduction, so I'm going to dispense with the introduction. India's foremost strategic thinker, public intellectual, is going to speak to us today about something that I think is of great contemporary relevance. One thing about Modi since coming to power has been his foreign trips. First Prime Minister of India to go to Australia in 28 years. And of course his other trips as well. So Professor Rajamohan will speak to us today about the new world pragmatism in India's foreign policy. So without any more delay, let's pass the floor to Professor Rajamohan.
Thank you, Sindar. Thanks for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be back at ISAS. Much of my work at ISAS has been on India's foreign policy, India's engagement with the world. In fact, the last few months have been quite exciting, tracking the seemingly hyper foreign policy activism of the new government and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Of course, some people have attributed some kind of a grand design, and that this is whole new activism is something very consciously designed. I mean, I think quite a bit of the activity was preset. That is the meetings in BRICS, in ASEAN, and, G20, and now SAARC. These multilateral meetings are set for them. The agenda, the dates get set by themselves. So those were in any case the routine that is now part of the annual calendar. And the reason why I visited Australia was actually because you were there on this trip, and then you haven't been there for so long. I mean, using that for bilateral. But I think there were some conscious, clear-cut initiatives, for example, with the US, with Japan, with the neighbors. So that's what I wanted to discuss, some of those initiatives of the new government. What I thought I'll do is really to just say a few words about Modi's emergence, because foreign policy does not take place in abstract, in vacuum. It's still rooted in the nature of the domestic politics and nature of the domestic governance. And I'll say some few words about how the last election changed some fundamentals about Indian polity, and how that facilitates his foreign policy. Then I'll briefly examine some of the basic elements of Modi's template in terms of the foreign policy construct that is brought to the table, and then look at 6 broad propositions on Modi's foreign policy, and then conclude with a brief discussion on the continuing challenges for India in India's foreign policy in the future. One, I think on the elections and the rise of Modi, I think the single most important fact, I think all of you are familiar with it and many of you have written about it, is really the first time you have a single party majority in the Lok Sabha. That is, it's not just a domestic political development. I think it's a development that has significant consequence of how the new government conducts foreign policy. Because if you don't have a strong government, I mean, I think most of us know that half the time the more difficult part is negotiating inside than when you're negotiating with your international interlocutors. So the weak governments of the last 3 decades have had huge problems dealing with the domestic dynamics of foreign policy, and we've seen by the end of the UPA too, I mean, I think it's virtually had lost even the notional monopoly on foreign policy, which the central governments had sustained for some time, but the weakness had become so apparent that actually lost control over the conduct of foreign policy, especially towards neighbors. The second aspect, I think, of the political change is the emerging prospect for BJP as a pan-national party. That is not just one election that we've seen significant increase in Bengal, in Tamil Nadu, and various other places. So for the first time, you're seeing the possibility of a pan-national party. So far we had none other than the Congress party, that the BJP could emerge as a pan-national party. And I think the elections in Maharashtra, Haryana show the expanding reach. And of course, they're even making a bold bid to get a majority in Jammu and Kashmir. Of course, that will be quite something that you're going to see whether they succeed at the end of the year or not. The second aspect, I think, the way the domestic dynamic has impact on foreign policy is the question of economic reforms and how quickly can he get India back on high growth path. There, I think the expectation that Modi, as a proven administrator in Gujarat, is going to do that. He's a reformer. That was the image that was created. But I think after the first budget, I think there is a sense that look, he's not going to just tick off boxes which the New York bankers or Western chancelleries are going to say, look, this is what you mean by reform. I think he's going to do it his own way, and Modi is not immune from domestic politics, so that it is not as if you just come and you have no, responsibility to domestic politics. So I think he's going to do it in a different way than the previous governments. I think so. He's certainly not a Modi. He's not a Reagan or a Thatcher, but I think quite clearly, to borrow a phrase from Channon, I think he might build capitalism with Indian characteristics rather than the version that you think of it from outside. That brings me to the second set of points I wanted to make was on the prehistory of Modi's foreign policy. I think while most people expected him to do something on the economic side, there were very few who thought he would do serious foreign policy and that he might even begin to like it. For a provincial leader, how the Foreign Office is laid out nicely, everything is scripted, beautiful settings, state receptions. I think obviously he's loving it, as they say. But I think the surprise there, I think, is that he had not much exposure as the CM of Gujarat, and most of his exposure was actually to the east. That is Singapore, China, Japan, Australia, and the only country to the west he went was Israel. That itself is interesting. I think we can talk about it. But essentially, given the American visa denial and the European refusal to entertain him because of the Gujarat riots, so he had very little exposure in the West, though of course many of them were going to the state. So I think so it was an unknown commodity in terms of what he was going to do on foreign policy, and I think he was quite smart enough not to say too much during the campaign. That is. That he did not try to articulate a great vision for foreign policy, and largely the manifesto was left to the old, I don't say old fogies. I mean, but the guys who were the old guard in the party to draft the manifesto, and it didn't have much to say in terms of a new vision. But I think he did step in when some of the manifesto created problems, which was the nuclear doctrine. What they said, look, we're going to revise our nuclear doctrine, which kind of got attention in the West, and they said, look, this guy is going to go crazy, he's going to fight a nuclear war. So I think he stepped in at that point to temper, saying that, look, no, we're not going to change anything, we're going to stick to Vajpayee's no first use, etc., etc. So I think he understood the importance of calming, because his image as a negative force, that he did not want to do anything that would reinforce it, and in fact he tried to do as much to temper down. Because only towards the end of the election campaign, he gave an interview to ANI, fairly detailed one, where he talked about US, China, Pakistan, all moderating the anti-Pakistan rhetoric, toning down the China rhetoric, and then essentially saying, look, we got to engage the US. So I think he tried to, because of this prehistory and the image that already had existed, through the election campaign, he sought to change, moderate it significantly. Then if you look at the first 6 months, I think what he's done is, began with a bang. He invited all the SAARC leaders to come for the swearing-in ceremony, which was a big surprise. Then he traveled in the neighborhood. He's saying neighborhood is a priority to Bhutan and Nepal. Then he's focused on Asia, I think hosting Xi Jinping, then traveling to Japan, and now to Australia and to Fiji. And more interesting part, I think, was the decision to go to the US. That is, within the party, there was quite a bit of resentment against the Americans because of the visa denial. And in the run-up to the election, every day some reporter would ask the State Department spokesman, what about Modi's visa? And they say, no, he's free to apply, but we will see what we can do. The policy. So, which was a kind of daily insult that was seemed to be coming from Washington, which I think put off the party very much. And in fact, large sections of the party and their associated, people who write on strategic affairs, were saying, look, you should not go to the US. In fact, Americans should apologize. Only if they apologize, go to New York, but don't go to Washington. So there's a deep anti-American sentiment. But I think he was quite quick to change that. And to say, the moment Obama called him, then he said, look, okay, we want to restore the relationship. And making it clear that, look, that this is nothing personal here. Because fundamentally, the US has not changed the visa policy towards him. As the Prime Minister, he's free to come, but they've not taken him off that list, the only one on that list. So I think, but yet he saw the importance of dealing with the US as an important element of India's strategy. So I think and then the trip, we can discuss some of the details a little later. Then that brings me to the third set of issues, which is on Modi's template. I mean, I think after 6 months, what is it that we see in terms of some of the core features? As you know, that the foreign policies of large countries do not change overnight. They do not change with the governments. Many things are set. The foreign offices don't cut much leeway to visiting ministers who come and go. So the permanent establishment's influence is always strong. In terms of what is done so far, I would say it's less about defining new goals, but essentially demonstrating the capability to pursue existing goals with vigor and purpose. Because you can say, look, India's foreign policy changed fundamentally, you can say, in 1991, when the structure changed inside, when the economic orientation changed, the Soviet Union collapsed. So the core adaptation in terms of that you needed a reorientation of India's external engagement happened in the 91, and it was a struggle. I mean, it is not that one day we had a new foreign policy. The struggle for adapting to that, I mean, that broad line, you can see 4 different governments of different political orientations actually pursue a slow but incremental adaptation on foreign policy. Narasimha Rao, Gujral, Vajpayee, Manmohan Singh. So the changes have been happening incrementally. And I think where Modi makes a difference is if towards the end Manmohan Singh looked like a weak, ineffective Prime Minister, what changes it now is a strong Prime Minister who's capable of doing things or of getting things done of what he promised to the world. So that is the significant difference, not in terms of recasting fundamentals, but of course there will be new initiatives under any new government. So which means essentially the foreign policy has been about ending self-doubt that had crept into India's positions in the last few years, and less inhibited in asserting great power ambitions. While you remember, whenever people say India a superpower, blah blah blah, Sonia Gandhi would step in and say, no, we don't want to be a superpower. And of course, Ramchandra Guha will say, look, no, India can never be a superpower. So this argument that, look, we don't want to be a superpower is a wrong idea. It doesn't work for us. So it's one thing for Ramchandra Guha to say it, but it's another for Sonia Gandhi to say that, look, that while the aspirations of middle class India were growing, and here you were saying, no, it's all about poverty, it's all about dumbing ourselves down rather than thinking big. So I think here is fairly brazen in terms of saying that, look, India is going to be great, India will be, our job is to make India great. So which is a different way of thinking about the future of India. And the other aspect, of course, is that there's no reference to non-alignment. While the previous government seemed to endorse non-alignment by non-alignment 2.0, all our friends were involved. I mean, Srinath and Pratap, and were actively supported by Sri Shankar Menon. The word non-alignment figures very prominently in the Congress Party's manifesto. Manifestos we don't take seriously, but it's always worth reading them. The Congress Party talked about non-alignment, talks about socialism. I mean, in fact, can you believe it? In the printed manifesto, they say we're going to strengthen our relationship with the socialist camp. Now, you must be genius, to think there is a socialist camp. Even Prakash Karat doesn't say it, but here is Congress, Rahul Gandhi's Congress says, no, we're going to do socialist countries. But this guy, none of that figured in the BJP manifesto. So I think it's quite interesting in that way. Then I think you also have probably the first pro-business Prime Minister India has ever seen. Because historically, the Brahminical contempt for business, dirty business, we don't, we need the money to win elections, but we're not going to do grubby stuff. So the disdain or of keeping businessmen away. If you see, Rahul Gandhi in 10 years went to CII just once, that too towards the end of towards the election campaign, because people are saying, look, they don't care. They're not interested in engaging the business community. So I think here you have actually someone who's really pro-business, which is actually a big plus, not big difference in Indian. If you look at all the previous prime ministers, this is a very, very different one. There's also the one, of course, you can combine to it is, of course, the Gujarati pragmatism. In fact, he's told business people, I think both in Tokyo in a public conference as well as to others, look, I'm a Gujarati and I have business in my blood. Now, this is, it's a very important thing. I think what he's saying that, look, he's not one of those landlubber, say the Brahmin from Nagpur or from Allahabad, who see the world in a universe, self-contained universe. That here is one of Gujarat, its oldest maritime tradition, of essentially outward-looking business-oriented, which is a fundamentally a different tradition that he brings. I think how far he can take it, of course, against the landlubbers in the heartland, that will still be a problem, because I think he still has problems to solve with RSS. But that's it. We'll come back to that if we need to. And finally, by centralizing power, both within the cabinet and within the state, that he brings greater authority to execution of foreign policy and is willing to take responsibility. Unlike the previous government who said, look, the PM had no authority, had no responsibility. So you could say nice things, but there was no way you could do anything or hold anybody else accountable for not doing something. So I think the structure internally in terms of the administratively changes in a very fundamental way. And lastly, in terms of the template, there is no, people asking what's your grand vision for India, what's your vision for economic reform, you have a foreign policy idea. So since foreign policy has become an industry that you need to know what exactly you're going to do, come and tell us your doctrine. No, I think he said it, look, I don't know anything about grand vision, whether in economics or foreign policy. My thing is about doing the small stuff. That in fact, his Wall Street Journal piece when he went to the US is look, it's important to get the right things done, getting things right, getting things done in the right way rather than just doing the right things as well. So in a sense, he's saying, look, I'm going to do small stuff, which is practical, pragmatic, and that is going to be as important as articulating a grand single vision for how the economy is going to be reoriented or how India's foreign policy is going to be conducted. Because I think, like all good politicians know, ambiguity gives you the options. That is, as long as you're clear about what you're doing, but to bring in total clarity, look, non-alignment 2.0, or I'm for socialism, which actually limits your freedom. So I think your actions can actually speak louder than saying. I think given the difficult domestic transition that awaits him, so I think it's a practical way of looking forward. Given that, can we lay down 6 broad propositions on what he has done so far? One, I think, is economy first. I think the emphasis on economy first, which is, all of us know instinctively, look, if your economy is not right, your foreign policy is not going to go very far, irrespective of how grand ideas you might have. But what he's doing, what he's saying is also that, look, I'm going to put Indian diplomacy at the service of Indian economy. The general sense, I think, Indian foreign policy over the decades, there's a sense of autonomy. Look, we do non-alignment, we have our positions we have taken. But he's saying, no, this has to be directed towards India's economic objectives. This has never been stated so clearly, so upfront as Modi has done. So I think, therefore, you see him meeting a lot of business leaders, whoever comes to Delhi, whether it's a Singaporean or whether it is a Japanese, whether it's an American. It's all the time for business leaders because he's trying to rekindle the India story that, look, India is back in business, we want you to come and invest. So this pitch he's making to international businesses that, look, come back to India, come and make in India, whatever the slogan is. So I think the emphasis is on how do you revive India's story, because there is considerable skepticism all around the world. So the question of spending that extra time with businessmen, of convincing them, look, it's worth coming back to India. The second proposition I have is that is restoring India's primacy in the neighborhood. That is, it's always been part of India's tradition that, look, India must be the dominant force in South Asia. But I think what's happened in the last few years, I think, has been a steady erosion of India's ability to lead the region. And I think if you read the BJP manifesto, the emphasis on saying that, look, we're going to put our relations with the neighbors back on track, and we want to do more. And I think the invitation for the South leaders, and then the first visits, you see that emphasis being made quite clearly that, look, we're going to do more in the region. If you're looking at it in a theoretical basis for that, I mean, I think it's quite clear that, look, if you don't dominate your own region, your ability to play a larger role in the world is going to be significantly undercut, that all major powers actually pacify their own neighborhood and contest the supremacy of the other powers in their neighborhood. So curiously, in some ways, the rising Chinese presence in South Asia, I think is compelling Delhi to think that, look, it's not as much as the Chinese success, it is as much about India's failure to be able to do things in the neighborhood. So therefore, you need something to deal with your own thing. And I think here, I mean, I think if you've seen his visit to Nepal, I mean, I think it tells you, I mean, I think I would suggest strongly, those of you looking at it, to take a closer look, and he's going to go back there end of this next week. I think it's a completely different way of dealing with a neighboring country than the way in which traditionally Indian bureaucracy, Indian security establishment has dealt with the neighbors. The condescending, I'll tell you what to do, I know what is good, all the things we criticize the United States for. When we just remove the US and put India, I mean, our neighbors will tell you, so the same thing, that you're as bad, I mean, that you're responsible for everything that happens in my country, and all the foreign hand arguments that India does so well, our neighbors do it even better, because the inability to actually to connect to the elites. So I think you saw him, I think his speech in the Nepal parliament is not a speech any bureaucrat would write. It's a speech that was directly addressed to the Nepali people. It was about connecting to them. It's about saying that, look, no Indian leader has said, look, Nepalese have died for India. After all, we recruit Nepalese into our army. Nepalese have died for Indian security. And to say that, look, I mean, that this is a very different relationship. And that we're going to deal with this in a political basis, not through bureaucracy, through RAW, or through the ambassadors, the viceroys, which has been the custom of the last 20 years. He's saying, look, we are ready to deal with you in a very fundamentally, and then spoke in Hindi, of course. In Nepal, Hindi is understood, so connected very well. Stepped out of his car, breaching security to shake hands with the people. So I think in one swoop, you had a communicator who could undercut the accumulated anti-India sentiments, I think, which is a very significant way. And you've seen how quickly within the last few months, we've signed the hydropower agreements, which were like pending around for 20 years. So you had here someone who says, look, so I think the whole mood in Nepal has changed. Of course, there will still be problems, but I think the fundamentals have been changed in a very interesting way. But Nepal, I think, is relatively easy because it's a very special relationship. The shared religion, of course, makes it easier. How are you going to do it in Bangladesh or other places, or Sri Lanka, where you have a serious ethnic issue? I think it's going to be quite testing in terms of how India moves forward. The third proposition is on Pakistan and China, and I think the two perennial problems for India. If you want to simplify, and I think what he has done so far, I mean, you can call it sweet and sour, which is that it's not a just expressing goodwill or saying, look, I'm going to beat you up, I mean, or we're going to fight forever. And there, I think with Pakistan, that the decision to invite the neighbors, I mean, I think Nawaz Sharif coming seemed to send, look, he's going to be different, and he's ready, he has the courage and will to engage Pakistan. And then you've also seen him cancel the talks abruptly, which has got a lot of criticism because they met the Hurriyat leaders. There, I think the essentially what he's saying that, look, I'm ready for a pragmatic economic engagement, but if you want to play hardball on Kashmir, we're going to play hardball. And that this is not going to be the previous government. All the previous governments might have agreed that you meet the Hurriyat leaders, the separatist leaders of Kashmir, wink and nod, we won't say anything. He's saying, look, the game is over, that game is over, we're going to do it differently. But how long can he sustain it, of course? But some would say it's even part of the Kashmir strategy that, look, they're going to play this differently even inside Kashmir. So it might fit into a broader framework of where Kashmir stands in the India-Pakistan negotiation. I know for a fact they've signaled a lot of proposals on economic liberalization, but Pakistan army is not ready. But I think, so the message is, look, we're ready for engagement, but we're not going to accept the kind of proposition that you brought. Some would say this is about unilaterally altering the terms of engagement, and it is true. For 20 years, there was a set of terms that were defined for engaging Pakistan. they will come and meet the Kashmiri leaders, we'll talk about Kashmir, and we'll complain about terrorism. So that framework is saying, look, I don't have to be going by that framework. So we have a different India, we have a stronger India, so we're going to deal with it different. I think something similar has also happened in the case of in China, which is actually, unlike Pakistan, of course, China is a rational economic actor, so there is a lot more economic possibilities. But I think what Modi has done fundamentally changed India's policy on China, which is, previous policy was, look, we say nice things about the Chinese, we pretend to be friends, we are Asian brothers and all that stuff, but actually don't let them come into anything economic. Don't give them visas, don't let, they can't do business, they can't do telecom, they can't do ports, they can't do, you name it. I mean, so the security wallahs were allowed to overwhelm the economic policy. What Modi is constructing is, look, I'm ready to do business, I'm open for business. So that's why he took him to Gujarat, signed these 2 agreements for economic industrial parks, because they still have to be implemented. But the fact is, he's saying, we're open for business with China. But at the same time, on the border, we're ready to stare you down. That we're not going to sweep the problems under the carpet, we're going to stand up, we're going to modernize, and we're not going to keep quiet. So this is very different from the previous policy, which was neither here nor there. The Chinese had no incentive to do business in India, but we had political and security problems which were not articulated clearly. And I think so how the China policy is playing out is going to be a very, very interesting one. And I think during the election campaign, he talked about Chinese expansionist mindset, went and said it in Japan. Because second day, Japanese tried to get even something more out of him. He said, no, once is enough. But basically you're saying, look, I'm willing to play hardball. Because the previous government constrained its relationship with Japan and the United States in the name of not angering China. But this guy is saying, look, I'm not inhibited. I'm going to do what I think is right with the Americans, the Japanese and the Vietnamese. But I'm open for business with you. So this is a different way of engaging China than what we've done in the last 20 odd years. And that brings me to the fourth point, which is about Asia. You've seen him devote a lot of attention to Asia, which is Japan was seen as a very special thing. Shinzo and Narendra were great friends, and they were tweeting messages and all that stuff. But and there again, I think the focus you saw was on getting Japanese economic investments, expanding defense cooperation. But there's still issues to be sorted out. But I think there is a more openness towards Japan, and something similar, very similar, you saw in the case of Australia, and now with the South Pacific. I think Fiji had 2 elements. I think one was the diaspora, which you had to deal. One of the relative, as percentage-wise, a small island country, but almost 40% is Indian. So you're basically in the same tradition. But at the same time, you're also saying that, look, we are a player in the Pacific. We're not going to let that go. In fact, I didn't get much headlines yesterday. A defense agreement was signed with Fiji. Partly, you're also competing with the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese influence is growing there. So you're saying, look, we're ready to do more in the South Pacific, which is kind of beyond the pale of traditional Indian policy. With ASEAN, of course, this is important. I think he said all the right things so far. Make in India, come and invest, connectivity. I mean, I'm sure Singapore is tired of, everyone knows the speech. I mean, any one of us can make that speech, which Indians make in the ASEAN meetings. The difference is going to be, can he implement it? So I think the key is going to be, is the implementation, because unlike many other parts of the world, ASEAN was eager to embrace India, open with arms outstretched, but the failure has been on the Indian part. So it is really about India's internal thing, that if you get your economy right, if you can follow through on agreements, then you're talking about a transformed relationship. That I think is something that needs to be seen. Then I think on the great power relationship, that with China and the US, I mean, that, as I said, look, I mean, the previous government was hesitant to move in either direction. You don't go too far with the Americans because the Chinese will get upset. You don't do enough with China because you've got other problems. So I think this guy is saying that, look, I'm ready to engage both China and the US. I don't have to claim non-aligned. I don't have to say I'm strategic autonomy. I'm going to do what is good for me on both. But I'm not going to, as what the old saying goes, deal with the Americans as if the Chinese don't exist, and deal with the Chinese as if the Americans don't exist. That you go for your independent, merit-based expansion of the relationship, which I think is a very different one from the previous government. And I think Europe, of course, is not still on the radar. Russian president will be there in a few days. But he's not going to abandon Russia because, but Russia's problems with the West, I think, is going to create problems for us because any, renewed tensions between Russia and the West help China and create problems for India. But that is something we have to deal with. Finally, I think the sixth point of the template, I think, is really about a pragmatic multilateralism. Because what we've seen happen in the last 10 years is to return to all the forgotten third worldist positions. Climate change, of course, you guys made the mess, you clean it, we're not going to do anything. WTO, we are willing to stand up and say, I wrecked WTO. I said, no, sorry, we're not going to do it. I mean, the old positions of seeming to be the skunk at the garden party, perennially the protester, the spoiler, and the only one taking credit for wrecking agreements. I don't know if you remember Kamal Nath coming out of WTO meeting and said, look, I wrecked it. Please congratulate me. It might play well at home, but it was not playing well outside. So initially you saw this government actually fall into the same trap of using the food subsidy argument on the trade facilitation agreement. But I think once he went to the US and he saw by the time there was a significant change, essentially signaling to Obama that, look, there will be flexibility on India's positions on all the multilateral issues. So you already seen the deal made with the Americans on trade. On climate change too, there is a new position that is being developed. You don't hear it very much, but he's saying, what the Americans have a term called faith-based climate change. That is, use the religious argument to break the left-right consensus in India. Both the rightists and the leftists say, look, India shouldn't do anything on climate change. It's all a Western creation, so therefore let them do it. From that he's saying, look, here is a country that worships nature, we worship our rivers, we want to clean up Ganga, we want to clean up Benares. So how are you going to take the position that, look, wrecking Mother Nature is fine? Just because the West did it, we're going to wait till they clean it up. So I think that fundamentally says that, look, we got to do something, we got to do this differently. And that he's trying to break that consensus by using a different set of arguments than the conventional arguments. Because the liberal argument had no cachet in India. To saying that, look, as a responsible power, you've got to do more. It was both the left and the right criticizing. So I think he's bringing new flexibility there. How far he can go is something we're going to see. I think and lastly about within this, I mean, there's been less of a third worldist rhetoric, than the previous government, and I think it's more of willing to do ad hoc, cut deals ad hoc manner with whoever is willing to do it, rather than take this preconceived ideological positions on multilateral issues. Lastly, that brings me to the last set of issues in terms of so far is a good story, but obviously there are problems. That fundamentally, that so far the talk has been good. He said all the right things. He's shown the political will to do some new things, like with Nepal, like with the US, like on defense, engagement with the Americans, or with the Japanese and the Australians. So there is that will. But can he follow through that? In a sense, getting the system, because the system is fundamentally inward-looking, despite the economic reforms of 1991 onwards. There is a system that is still fundamentally the IAS system. It's fundamentally inward-oriented and unwilling to engage the world on a pragmatic basis. So what he's proposing is a fundamentally different thing. There's more business orientation, practical deal-making, and move on by changing the way you operate internally. Now, for that, you need to fundamentally change the structures. To the extent that he has said various things, all of them hold potential, but then at this point, no one can judge, look, he's going to succeed. But I think he's trying to set a new path, but the structure remains the same. So how do you change that? And I think he's already shown, he's dropped the railways minister, he's saying that those who don't perform will go. But to crack the whip on the whole system as a whole is going to be, I think, a big problem. And then I think you have the whole question of building domestic consensus. The opposition is licking its wounds now, but sooner than later, for example, we do a deal on climate change. That's going to bring the left and the right and say, look, you guys are selling out. Then how do you've got to make your political argument far more vigorously than cutting deals pragmatically at the bureaucratic level. then I think, and the problem is, for example, on Bangladesh. I mean, here the historic boundary agreement lying there. Now the BJP Congress did not do the deal because they said, look, Mamata Banerjee will get upset. Mamata Banerjee was going to be important in the next elections. But can the BJP say, look, stand up and say, look, the land boundary agreement is in India's interest. If we don't do it, we're going to lose. So therefore, let's do it. Now, to do that, the problem is again with the BJP's state level units in Bengal or Assam, who say doing this is going to cost me the election, so let's not do it. So the Congress was responsible for putting domestic political interests above national interests. Can he actually force the party to transcend where direct stakes are involved in elections? Both Bengal and Assam are going to go to elections. Can he say, look, the boundary agreement with Bangladesh is more important than winning the elections? I mean, can he make that argument internally? He's promising that he's going to deliver to them. He's told that to the various people who come from Dhaka, but can he deliver that? But that's something you got to see. And then the biggest problem, I think, is really producing that synergy between competing different systems. I mean, the different agencies of the government of India, between the Foreign Office, Defence, Commerce and Finance. Each one is operated in its own universe. And the ability of the PMO to lead that in an orchestrated coordination has been weakened significantly in the last 10 years. And can he bring that back in terms of getting everyone to work towards the same goals? I think that is going to be a big problem. And lastly, the BJP own ideology is a problem. That what we don't know is, like, prima facie you can say, look, he's different from the BJP. In fact, you remember when Vajpayee came to office, everybody said, look, this is going to be Hindutva foreign policy. Because he did the nuclear test, he said, this is all Hindutva stuff. But those of us who followed, I mean, he refused to let the BJP, the party or the RSS to influence his worldview, because Vajpayee was senior enough. But this guy is not in the same position. He's clearly different. What he's saying on economics, what he's saying on foreign policy is not the conventional line of the RSS, which is probably a petty bourgeois, nationalist, inward-looking, nativist party, a nativist organization, xenophobic to boot as well. But here he's a Gujarati who's fundamentally trade-oriented, outward-looking, engaging the world. How does the tension play out between his instincts, and can he force the prevail over the RSS fundamentally on trade issues? There is no difference between CPM and the RSS, between Swadeshi Jagran Manch and the loony anti-globalizers. So they're all. So how do you make that final break and take India towards actually consciously articulating its own interests? Of these are India's interests, we're going to do this differently. To the extent that he's got support from the middle class and the youth, that he can mobilize them. But then it's a fight. There will be blood on the floor. Can he actually do that in terms of pushing India's interests in a fundamentally different way? I think I'll stop here.